Okay, I think we are live. Well, hello, friends. Welcome back to SerenityOS office hours. Hopefully you can hear and see me. And it's been yet another week, and we're back here doing the same old thing. And I am kind of growing to like the routine. So let's see. Oh, hello, Jane. Welcome to the office hours. Are you here looking for secret features? Because maybe we'll show something. Okay, great. People showing up, very nice. Okay. Yeah, so I'm still tweaking the audio-visual setup back and forth, but it seems like we've seen a large increase in quality recently, so hopefully I keep tuning in the right direction. Anyways, so welcome everybody. If you're not familiar with office hours, what we do here is we just talk about whatever you want to talk about. So if you have technical questions about SerenityOS or non-technical questions about SerenityOS, this is the place to be. Just ask and we will try to dive into whatever you want to dive into. So let's see, Joe is here with a question. So hello, Andreas. Can you please comment on how IPC works in the system, specifically how endpoints are generated from the IPC file? Yes, absolutely. So our IPC files look like, so one that I was working on just yesterday, they look like this. So you describe an endpoint and you have these sort of C-like, C++-like API definitions that look like functions. And the difference is that every one of them tells you whether it's a synchronous or asynchronous API. So this symbol here means that it's asynchronous because there is no return response. Whereas this symbol here means that in response to this message, you will get a return message that contains these values. So it's pretty simple. And the way that we generate code from this is we have this thing called the IPC compiler. So IPC compiler main CPP is a program that does all the work. So it starts, let's go to main. It starts by opening the file and then lexing and parsing it. So it turns it into a set of these objects. I forget, I haven't looked at it for a while, but so it creates these endpoint objects and message objects and so on from the IPC file. So it turns this text here into a C++ representation of the contents, and then we iterate over these endpoints and generate the C++ code from them. So I think we do it in two passes because we generate the headers we only generate headers actually. So it's a single pass thing. And if we look at config server, and then let me open a second pane here. And also let me resize my C-line so that everything's on screen. So if we open the generated code, config server endpoint. So this code here is all generated from this code by the IPC compiler. So it spits out this class definitions and enums and everything for these messages. So essentially, every API in the endpoint turns into one or two messages. One if it's an asynchronous API, but if it's a synchronous API, then it turns into a request and a response message. And these messages are C++ classes that you can then instantiate by passing them this set of inputs. And then there's a little bit of layers on top of that just for convenience. For example, we allow you to inherit from the generated endpoint basically, and then you get virtual things that you can override in order to implement the various things. So if you are on the side of the client, then you are calling these APIs remotely, then you're just sending these messages, right? But if you are on the side of the server, what you do is you inherit from the generated endpoint, and then you get all of these things as virtual functions that you get to override. So in config server, we have this thing called a client connection, which is the class that inherits from the config server endpoint. So what happens here is that, as you can see, we have these messages as virtual functions. So pledge domains, for example, is an override, and that overrides the pure virtual implementation or pure virtual function in the config server endpoint base class. That's sort of how it all fits together. And I realized that that was a high-level view, and if you have more specific questions, I'm happy to go into details. But the best way to get familiar with this is really just to hack on it, I think, and try to use it for something, because once you try to use it, you will very quickly figure out how it works. So let's see. M. Costa says, wow, I finally arrived at the beginning of a stream. Hello, friends. Hello, M. Costa. Welcome to the stream. Manuel says, does SerenityOS have a BPF story? I assume by BPF you mean Berkeley Packet Filter. We do not have a Berkeley Packet Filter story. If you mean something else, then please specify. Okay, so Miyoyo says, hey Andreas, SerenityOS seems to put a lot of emphasis on isolation and things like pledging, etc. Do you think an Android-like permission request system would fit into Serenity? I think there is room for something like it. So let me show you something that we've been working on recently, which is mediated file system access. So for example now, if you open something in the text editor and then you, let's say that we change something about it. Also that looks weird. The preview is a little goofy. Then if we try to save this, then it now pops up this dialog or message box asking you if you want to allow text editor to write to this file. And this is something that we're still working on, but it fundamentally, what we're doing here is we're sandboxing the text editor, so it doesn't actually have access to the file system, but instead it knows what path it's trying to edit, but when it tries to actually write it out to disk, it goes and talks to this thing called the file system access server. And then file system access server is the thing that pops up this question, and if you say yes here, then it opens the file for writing and then passes the file descriptor to text editor. So this is just one example of something like that, where you sort of have programs don't have direct access to the resource, but instead they have to go through a mediating service. And I think it's rather nice. Same thing, like if you click on the open thing here, then this open dialog is provided by the file system access service. So it can see the entire file system, whereas text editor itself actually cannot. If we look at the text editor here in the system monitor, and we look at the unveiled paths, we can see that it only has very, very limited access. And actually it has the original file we opened unveiled for read. I think that's probably a relic that we should get rid of. But if you open any other file, it should still work. It's just that, yeah, it doesn't change the unveil paths. So yes, it doesn't have access to the whole file system. So it's provided by file system access server. And I think to your question about like this Android system, I have limited experience with Android, but I'm assuming it's similar to what iOS does, where certain system resources are guarded by an extra layer of permissions. And I like it. So let's see, Dominic says, does SerenityOS have something like dbus? Not really, but we do everything with separated IPC services rather than having a bus where everybody talks to each other. We instead have a set of isolated IPC services that you can talk to. So for example, if you want to do a DNS lookup, then you speak to the lookup server over IPC. And if you want to do an HTTP request, then you talk to the request server and so on. But we don't have anything like dbus at the moment. I don't know if we would benefit from having something like that potentially. But with everything in Serenity, we always try to let the use case drive the framework and infrastructure rather than building random frameworks and infrastructure and hoping that the use cases show up later. So Ashish says, what job did you do in the past? Please give some explanation. Well, I've had a number of different jobs. I have worked on web browsers for a very long time. So I worked on I worked at Nokia for 2 years on the browser that went into the Nokia N9 phone, and a number of other internal browser related projects as well. I also worked on Qt WebKit, the web engine in the Qt project. And then I moved to Apple and I worked on the Safari web browser and the WebKit project for 7 years or so. And then after that, I worked on some industrial networking equipment for 5G things. That was the last job I had before I quit to do this instead. But I've been basically around browsers and telecommunications for the majority of my career, and doing low-level programming the whole time. So let's see. Vakar says, probably a very dumb question. Well, we'll see. But I cloned and ran SerenityOS, but could not figure out how to play the example video file. How would one go about installing an application like Video Player? There is no video player yet. That's the issue. So there's a video library sort of growing. I think it's a VP9 decoder that Hunter has been working on, but it's not ready yet. We just have the video file in the system so that you can test the decoder as we improve it. So Joe, and there is no video player yet. Although it was over a year ago now, but somebody built an MPEG-1 decoder, an MPEG-1 video player. But the problem with that was that it was using an external library for the video thing. And then we said that, well, we don't want to have third-party code. And the person working on it seemed partly interested in sort of redoing it in Serenity style C++ and making it native to the project, but I think maybe that turned out to not be fun and it went nowhere. But I don't know. It's something that would be nice to have, and it's something that is slowly being worked on, but there isn't a video player right now. So Joe, following up on the IPC stuff, saying, one brief extra question. How is the message actually sent? Oh, right. So the messages are sent, let me show you. So let's say that we call something like async, or let's use one of these as an example. So pledge domains here, or even monitor domain, which takes only a string. So let's look that up. So it generates a function called async monitor domain. And this is how it looks. this is the generated code. So it has an internal connection object, and then it calls post message on it, and then it constructs one of these message objects. So monitor domain is the message object that we generate from the API definition. So this thing turns into this class, as I talked about earlier. So you instantiate one of those things, and then you pass it to post message. And post message can take anything that inherits from IPC message. So you pass that in, and then what happens in post message is that it asks the message to encode itself. So that is a thing that generates a message buffer. A message buffer is really just a vector and a set of optional file descriptors. So most messages don't have an associated file descriptor, but some of them do. Like if you're sending a piece of shared memory across the IPC boundary, then you have to include it as a file descriptor. And then what we do is that we bundle that together with the message, and then use sendFD and receiveFD to actually pick up the file descriptor on the other side. And something that's good to know about the IPC system is that the messages are always sent and received in serial order. So we don't have any such thing as a priority message that goes before others in the queue or something like that. So if everything happens in the sequential order that you queue it up, which makes a lot of things much, much simpler. Like, for example, the file descriptor handover. So let's see. Dun, dun, dun. Dither8 says, what is the best protocol for network file transfer between two Serenity systems? Well, probably HTTP, I guess. That's something that we support natively. So we have a web server, and we have an HTTP client, both a command line client and the browser. So probably at the moment, that's the best natively supported protocol. If you install ports, then you could get something like SSH and use that. So Dead Marshall says, does Serenity use X or Wayland? It uses neither. We have our own thing that we call Windows Server, which is a completely from scratch frame buffer based window compositor and window management system. Panta82 says, if the config server, why didn't you use static string constants instead of hard-coding domain and section string literals all over? Maybe even put them in a shared header to coordinate between apps. Well, maybe, but these sort of things are, I would consider like premature optimization at this point, and not like premature optimization for the purpose of speed, but like premature tightening of the APIs. So the API for config server right now and for libconfig is kind of loose and sloppy because I haven't yet discovered what I want to do with it or how I want it to look. So at the moment, I'm not putting that much effort into like making it efficient or tight or whatever. But it's something that we'll come back to once we have figured out what exactly is this thing and how does it work, then we can come up with much, much more elegant solutions. And these examples that you give here are not bad examples in any way. I just think that it's not the right time to focus on things like that. So let's see, I use Arch, says, I don't know what to ask, so I'm just gonna say hi. Hello, I use Arch. I was told to expect a by the way after I use Arch, but I see that you don't do that. That's good. So M Costa says, does the Serenity build system support LLVM/Clang? Do you have any thoughts on using it instead of GCC? So we do have Clang support, and as of recently, we are also building with Clang on our continuous integration system. So thanks to the hard work of Daniel Bertalan and a bunch of other people like Tim and Linus did some stuff, and I forget everybody who worked on that, but we now have a Clang build, and if we look at CI, then where do I see that? I'm not logged in. We have an Azure pipeline now as well, in addition to our GitHub CI. And here you can see we have these two passes, so Clang i686 and Clang x86-64. And I haven't actually tested it myself, but I hear that, or I see that it has exposed a whole number of things that we were doing that were kind of GCC dependent, and it's been really, really good to add a different compiler to the mix because it exposed things that we were just relying on GCC idiosyncrasies or specific behaviors. And like really weird things as well, like the order of things in the generated executable. We assume that like, oh, this thing will always come before that thing, and then you build with Clang and you get a different order in the ELF. So, and you know, like 100 other random little things around the code base that have been fixed because of that. So that's been awesome. Mustafa says, do you think Serenity should eventually have an in-house Git client, or do you think there's some things where we should just stick to existing optimized implementations? I don't think that there's anything where we should stick to the existing optimized implementation. And Git is no different. Eventually somebody will come along and say, well, this seems really interesting. I'm going to work on that. And maybe that will be me, maybe that will be somebody else. But I don't like the idea of thinking that, oh, we can't do this, right? So Chap Exit says, AV decoding is a reasonably high bar to cross. There's a reason most projects use FFmpeg or other existing libraries. Sure, yes, but we are not those projects. John Doe says, a little off topic, I started contributing to Chromium and been doing it for the past 3 months. Is there any chance I could get hired by Google/Microsoft one day? Yes, absolutely. I certainly leaned heavily on my involvement with the WebKit project when I got a job at Apple. Just like I leaned on my involvement with the KDE project when I got a job at Nokia. I'm a very big fan of using open source participation as a way to get your foot in the door with companies that do these things. And Chromium is, I'm not familiar with how they run their project anymore. I used to know more about it, but I've been out of that environment for too long. But I absolutely think that you're way better off contributing to Chromium if you want to get a job working on Chromium than not contributing to Chromium. Just make sure that what you do is sort of purpose-driven, not in the way that you're like I don't know, like acting like you want to get a job, but that you actually try to expand your knowledge and skills within the project. Because like just because you have 100 commits fixing spelling errors and stuff like that, it doesn't mean anything, right? But if you actually grow into a competent Chromium developer that can actually work on parts of the system, then you can absolutely get hired. And I think that's probably the best way to get hired. I know that when I worked at Apple and I was interviewing job candidates, if anybody had prior experience working on WebKit, they always bubbled to the top of the queue immediately, because it's just so much more interesting to hire somebody with precisely relevant experience, right? You will most likely skip ahead in every queue. Okay, so Manuel says, not a question, but Rubber Duck Engineering recently had a very interesting video on Fuchsia internals / Zircon kernel, content addressable file system, and so on. You might find it inspirational. Yeah, I saw that. That was Eric and Adam going through some Fuchsia stuff. I used to work with those guys on the WebKit project. They were both very active in WebKit back in the day, like 10 years ago. And it was funny to see them again. And I did see the video. It was interesting. Let's see. Oh, it's a super chat from Luke Z. Thank you, Luke Z, saying, nice to see that the Twinings affiliate link is working, but I cannot justify the international shipping costs, so here's a super chat. Thank you, Luke. Yes, so in the last office hours, people pointed out that my Twinings affiliate link was broken, and I have since figured out what was wrong, and I generated a new one, and now you can order your tea through my affiliate link if you want to support me with a couple of pennies, I suppose, or whatever the British call their small coins. But I really appreciate the super chat. Thank you. Let's see. Let's not lose track here. So Ömer says, what is the best protocol to use to exchange data between two separate applications on local? Is this protocol implemented in SerenityOS? So when we want to exchange data between two applications in Serenity, if there's any kind of structure to it, then we usually create an IPC protocol with a clearly defined server and client. Basically, everything in the system is client-server based in some way, like everything that interacts with other parts. We don't really have a sort of peer-to-peer application data exchange story. The closest thing that we have to that at the moment is probably the clipboard, where you have a clipboard server that mediates the access to, like, whatever you copy in one program is then held on to by the clipboard server until somebody wants to paste it. But I don't know. And I don't know if there's some like generic protocol for things like that. And if there is, then we don't implement it. So Nico says, did you ever notice that Agnostic Kit and Andreas Kling have the same abbreviation? Did you ever consider changing your first name to Agnostic? So that is actually the first time that anybody has pointed that out, and I had not thought about it, but I think I will keep my first name. Thank you. Let's see. Hans Hoffman says, for your information, there is a nice piece on Serenity on the 2.5 admin podcast with Jim Salter and Alan Jude. Interesting. I did not know that. I have to check that out. I spoke to Jim Salter last week when he was writing the piece on Serenity for Ars Technica. Then I spoke with him for a while before or as he was writing the interview, and he was a very nice guy. I really enjoyed it, and like the article came out awesome, so I have to check that out. We should all check that out. Let's figure out where that is right now, actually. 2.5 admins, 2.5 admins. Oh, look at that. News and discussion. They're talking about Serenity. How long is this thing? Can we get a preview? 30 minutes. Okay, I'm gonna drop this in the chat so that everybody can check out 2.5 admins later on. Thank you very much, Hans, for the tip. We will definitely be checking that out. Let's see. Toto says, how does the SerenityOS process scheduler work? Well, this is actually, this is funny. This is something that comes up in almost every office hours, I feel like. But it's not a trivial question, but people often ask about it. So it's a simple round robin scheduler with priority queues. So processes, or threads rather, it's a thread-based scheduler. It does not schedule processes, but it schedules threads. And the threads go into these things called thread-ready queues. And there is a fixed number of thread-ready queues, and then based on the number of priorities that we have. And then what we do is when the scheduler runs, it just interrupts the CPU. A timer interrupts the CPU at a regular interval, and then it picks from the highest priority queue until it's empty. So it just runs stuff in that queue until that's empty. And then it goes down to the next highest priority queue, runs stuff until it's empty. And basically they become empty when the processes decide to go idle, right? So when they block for some reason. And that's the basic idea. And all of this stuff is contained in the scheduler.cpp file in the kernel. There's a little bit of trickery going on, but it's nothing particularly fancy. And you can definitely, if you sit down to read this thing, you can probably understand how it works. Let's see. Gregory says, do you prefer coding in silence or while listening to music or a podcast or something like that? I struggle to listen to music or podcasts, especially because I don't know what it is. Something in my brain clashes. If I try to write code and then I hear words at the same time, I get very, very distracted and I start typing what I'm hearing. So I don't know. I have, in the past, I've said that I think that there's maybe some overlap between the programming language part of the brain and the natural language part of the brain. And if they're not in sync, then there's like this race condition where you accidentally type what you're hearing sometimes. So I do like to listen to music, but I listen to music without words typically. So like electronic music or this like lo-fi things that are so popular on YouTube these days. Just anything without human language. Let's see. But of course, when I make videos, I just sit in silence. Let's see. FFS Ray uses NixOS, by the way, and wants everybody to know. That's cool. Let's see. SGS1 says, how hard would it be to make animated GIFs usable as desktop wallpapers? Well, it depends on what you mean by usable. Certainly in our architecture, it would involve a lot of repainting, and the system would be like, you would be dedicating a significant slice of system CPU time to just redrawing the desktop. But I think in the future, if we have something like accelerated graphics, then it might be more feasible. But right now, like doing an animated GIF as a desktop wallpaper would probably be, I don't know, it feels like it wouldn't be possible to do that in a nice way without chunking up too much CPU. At least in Serenity. So League of Legends player says, hi, is it possible to build SerenityOS with Windows as a host system? Did someone try this already? Yes, it is certainly possible. Many people use Windows subsystem for Linux as their development environment for Serenity. And we have instructions for that, I believe, in the repository. So let me go and look that up actually. So documentation, build instructions, there's build instructions, but if you look down, there's build instructions Windows. And check this out. You might find that very helpful. Let's see. Andy says, any current or planned OS level virtualization features? If not, do you think that this is something that would make sense to have in Serenity? I don't have a plan for anything, as you know, but I do think it would be certainly very nice to be able to have a high performance QEMU-like thing and that we could run in Serenity so that you could boot Serenity in a little window using virtualization within Serenity, right? So that would be very helpful for testing. Let's see. We got super chats down here. Let's see. So Omni says, Kung är du. That is Swedish. It means king are you. Can you talk about elf loading and elf relocation in Serenity? Yes, absolutely. So the kernel does elf loading when you open up something. So the main entry point into that is the exec syscall. So sysexecv. And the first thing we do, of course, is like fetch all the various parameters you're passing to exec, like the arguments and the environment for the spawn process. And then we call process exec, which we have to check first if it has a hashbang at the start. You know, if it's a hashbang bin sh executable shell script or something like that. So we have to go and look for that, the first thing we do. And if so, we launch it in a shell instead of trying to load it as an elf. But if it doesn't have a hashbang, or what's it called? A shebang, not hashbang, sorry. But if it doesn't have a shebang, then we think that it's an elf of some kind. And so we will begin loading it in do exec, I think, is where we do the thing. And there's a whole bunch of little steps here, and it's kind of hard to go through them and talk about each one without getting extremely deep. But essentially, the way elf loading works is that we map the executable into memory, and then we put this thing called we have a library called libelf, and libelf has something called an image. Oops. And then we just map the executable into memory somewhere in the kernel, and then we instantiate an image and pass it. This is like a view class, so you just make an elf image view on top of the image, and that allows you to iterate over program headers for each program header. And that is essentially what the kernel does. So the kernel will, let's see, readelf-l. Let's get a kernel. Let's look at some executable. So like a shell, for example, right? So the kernel will iterate over these program headers, and depending on what they say, it will do something. So if it tells you which interpreter to use, that means that, okay, this is a dynamically linked program. We have to actually load the loader instead. So then we do that. And then it also wants us to map some parts of it into memory at some points. And just a sec. Once we have loaded these things where they're wanted, what happens next is that we will begin executing the loader. And loader is a user space program that performs the dynamic linking. So when you start a program, you're really starting the dynamic loader. And then the loader is responsible for actually loading all of the various libraries and stuff that you need. And the relocations are done by the loader as well. So the loader does a whole bunch of steps. Relocation is one of them. And it's been a while since I worked on this, but as I recall, if you have a library like, I don't know, like libpdf, for example, then what is the way to see the relocations? Is it -r? I think it's -r, yeah. So every library and executable has these lists of relocations, and then what we do is we just iterate through them and patch up the code. So for each relocation, you can find that the dynamic loader does this kind of stuff. So for each relocation, it calls this thingy called do single relocation, which calls do relocation. And then here we branch on or we switch on the relocation type. So depending on the type of relocation, we have to do different things, right? But very often this is sort of what we do. We have a patch point, and then we patch in the right address of the relocated thing. And there's obviously a lot of details to this, but the high level perspective is that the kernel loads the dynamic loader, and then the dynamic loader loads everything else and performs the relocation after mapping all of the necessary libraries. Let's see. Neil says, does Serenity support running at different frame rates / screen frequencies, or does the screen output at a fixed frame rate? It runs at 60 FPS at the moment, and that is kind of sloppy. It's really just a 16 millisecond timer in the compositor that that drives the screen updates. So you can try to paint more, but we will just read all the screen every 16 milliseconds, approximating 60 FPS, actually a little bit more than 60 FPS, but yeah. Let's see. TrapExit says, I'm not saying don't try to build your own things, but one can't simply ignore the cost of doing so, both in terms of the physical effort, but also the knowledge required. Some of that math is no joke. Right, but still, these are things that you can learn and do. I don't think it's particularly constructive to mythologize the difficulty of these things. Like, these are things that you can learn and you can do, and then yes, it takes time to do them, but so what? We have time. Let's see. John Doe says, thank you for answering regarding Chromium. You really inspired me to contribute to Chromium. It's just that I don't know anyone who went through this route and got hired. Well, you know me. I went through this route, and at least it was a large part of why I got hired, certainly at Apple. When I interviewed at Apple, almost everybody that I spoke to during the interviews knew me from WebKit. So it was a huge increase in just comfort with the situation, the fact that everybody had seen my code already. So Matthias says, good afternoon, Andreas. Can you show how shared libraries work in Serenity? You hinted at their introduction in early videos, but never seemed to dive into it on video. Right, so that's kind of what I just talked about. Shared libraries work like I was just saying, that when you spawn a program that is dynamically linked, then it has sort of a list of dependencies. And then what you're really doing when you're launching the program is that you're launching the dynamic loader, telling it to launch this program. And then the dynamic loader figures out what the dependencies are, maps those into memory, figures out what all the symbols are, and then patches everything up so that it works. And that is the basic outline. If you have specific questions, I'm happy to talk about those. So M. Costa with the super chat saying, asking with super chat for no reason. Hypothetically speaking, if I want to create a command line tool for Serenity, which ones should I look as example? So I think most of the tools in Serenity are decent examples of our practices. Of course, there's a spectrum of quality. Some tools have received more work and more love than others. Some of them are probably unchanged for years, but the basic ideas are usually there. So it really depends on what kind of tool you want to build. If you have a more specific tool in mind, then whatever it is, I would recommend just looking at some tool that is similar to what you want to do or in the same category, and just trying to, I don't know, build something similar to that. And I guess if there is something that you want to share code with that we already have, then that's also something that's good to think about. But for one-off stuff, it is okay to duplicate a little bit of functionality. But without specifics, it's hard to tell. But I think like any of the tools that's like less than 500 lines is probably a decent representation of what you could be doing. Let's see. InAlone says, you've mentioned before about getting Serenity to a point where you can work on Serenity within Serenity. I understand how the userland emulator will run userland programs, but what about the kernel? Right. We cannot run the kernel in the user space emulator. And for that, we would need either a whole machine emulator, which is something that's one of my other hobby projects, and I have one. It doesn't currently run Serenity, but it could probably be made to run Serenity. It has run it in the past. But as I was talking about earlier, virtualization might be the better choice here to integrate some CPU virtualization features into our kernel so that we could have high performance VMs running Serenity for kernel development and stuff. That's probably the more convenient option. And yeah, that's probably the better option for that. I have no experience using CPU-based virtualization technology, so it's an area where I would have to look into to be able to give more detailed answers than that. But I think that's probably the best step forward. Musab says, hey Andreas, I'm working on a pull request about TimeDashN, and I'm nervous because it is my first contribution to SerenityOS. It is a slight speed optimization, not life-changing. Am I welcome to send it anyway? Sure. I mean, if something can be done better, then let's do it better. I think the main thing to consider when it comes to speed optimizations is that if you are sacrificing readability or understandability to get unimportant performance, then we should not be doing that. But if you can improve performance while maintaining or increasing code quality, like making it more readable, more understandable, more expressive at the same time, then I have absolutely nothing against that. I think the only type of optimization that that I don't want to see is like convoluted optimization of performance insensitive things, like things that don't matter for performance. We shouldn't sacrifice code quality to make them faster. But either way, I'm looking forward to seeing your first pull request. So Neil says, how does Serenity deal with the deletion of files? So Serenity is a Unix-like system. So we have in-memory inodes in the kernel, and they have a reference count. And if you have a file open, but you do RM on it, then that file still exists in the kernel until you close it, right? Just like every other Unix. At least with the ext file system, you have a reference count on disk, which is called the inode link count, and that is separate from the memory in-memory ref count that we have in the kernel. So in Serenity, everything in the kernel that is a file in some file system inherits from the inode class, and it is a reference counted type. So anybody can make a ref putter or non-null ref putter to an inode, and that will keep that inode alive for as long as they keep that ref putter. What we do is, once we discover that there are no more references to the inode, so the memory object is deleted, and then, for example, let's go and look at the ext2 inode destructor. Then we look here. So this means that there's no more in-memory references to this inode. It's being destroyed in the kernel. We check, well, is there any on-disk reference to it? So do you have any links on your inode? If not, we tell the file system to free this inode, and this will return it to the inode bitmap as an available inode. And of course, free any blocks associated with it and so on. The behavior is implemented in every file system class because different file systems handle it differently. But at the high level, the thing to know is that there's an in-memory inode and there's an on-disk inode. And the in-memory inode ultimately controls when physical deletion happens. So Pablo says, hi, what compilers are available for Serenity? In which languages can I work inside the OS? So in terms of natively supported things that we work on ourselves, there is JavaScript support, and there's the shell language. And then we have some HTML and CSS, obviously, for the browser. And we have a growing, but still early days, C++ Lexer and parser. But if you are willing to install ports, then there's all kinds of ports. We have like, GCC, with Python, Lua. I think there's a Ruby now as well. PHP and various smaller languages like VLang and other stuff. So it depends on if you want to use ports or not, but there's a whole bunch of them in the ports tree. So I recommend looking there. Let's see. Oh, I'm falling behind a bit here. Let's see. Kong Dang says, hi, could you talk about how the profiler records all the functions and syscalls? Yes, absolutely. So the profiler, or actually, let me talk about it first. The way it works is that when you begin profiling something in the system, then we start a separate timer for that called the profiling timer, which is a high frequency timer that we run in the kernel, and that it interrupts the execution at a regular interval and just samples the stack. So we're not actually recording function calls when you're profiling or syscalls, but rather what we do is that we interrupt execution at a regular interval every couple of milliseconds, and we capture the call stack at that moment. And then what you do afterwards is you take all of these stack samples and then you process them and build up a tree where you can visualize like how many of the stack samples had this exact subtree and so on. And that's what you see when you're looking at it in the profiler. You're just seeing a mashup. There are words for this. I'm lacking the vocabulary right now, but you're seeing like a mashup of all of those stack samples into a tree, and that's how it records them. Landkeeper says, do you play Capture the Flag or have hacking experience before? I don't play CTF, but I have done a bunch of like this hack this machine type challenges in the past, sure. Most of my hacking have been on Serenity itself, like trying to break into it. And actually, speaking of CTFs, I did see that the LS CTF group, they are doing their annual, or I don't know if it's an annual thing actually, but there's the LS CTF coming up next weekend with a whole bunch of prize money. And LS was one of the teams that hacked SerenityOS in a CTF competition a year ago. So if you're interested in the CTF that they made, then go check that out. I will link it in the chat if I can find the chat thing. Clickety clack. All right. Let's see. Robert says, first time catching a live, so now I'm finally giving building and trying out Serenity a spin. Pretty hefty workout for my poor laptop. Yeah, it is like that. The build is always getting a little bit slower as the system grows and complexity increases. And my recommendation is if you want to keep up to date with the system and you have a very slow machine, then definitely make sure you have Ccache installed, and maybe I don't know, maybe like if you're gonna work on the system, it's different. If you're just building it, then it can be kind of punishing because like you git pull and then you have to rebuild 3,000 files or whatever. But if you're working on the system on a slow machine, it is good to practice the the discipline of trying to make changes that don't affect build time so much by being careful with touching headers and things like that. That's something I'm very careful with myself to try to avoid large rebuilds. Let's see. Berkai says, do you plan to explain, maybe in a video series, how Serenity solves regular operating system problems such as scheduling, multitasking, booting, kernel internals, blah, blah, blah? Well, I have done that in the past, so I don't know. I mean, I don't have a plan for anything. That is, there's kind of well-established meme on this channel that there is no plan. So that said, though, if you go to my channel, you can look at playlists, and then there is presentations. And here you can find my younger self speaking about how Windows Server works. And there's a bunch of other videos and code tours where we go through different parts of the system. If you want to learn it. Now, some of them are older, of course, so they're a bit outdated. But I don't think that I will be making any kind of educational content outside of Serenity, because that's just not what I do. There are plenty of people doing that already. But you asked specifically about how SerenityOS solves regular OS problems. And maybe, I don't know. We'll see. Let's see. I'm falling behind so much. Let's see. Ditherate says, hey Andreas, what ports will you and won't you use when Serenity becomes your main? Well, I guess I'll probably keep using a compiler port. And probably a Git port. At least to begin with, but at the same time, I don't know. It depends on what type of stuff is available at that moment. Big Knife Wrangler says, are cat, grep, sed, and awk implemented in Serenity's shell yet? Neither of these things are actually shell commands. They are separate executables in every Unix system I'm familiar with. And we have cat and grep. We do not have sed or awk. However, we do have ports of other implementations of sed and awk. So Valtteri says, would you rather import Computron into the Serenity source tree or implement a new virtualization solution from scratch? I.e., does Computron count as third-party software? Well, I wouldn't want to import it because of the code quality, I think. And I would rather build it from scratch. I wouldn't build it the same way it is now anyway. It has a Computron is not well architected like Serenity is. It was sort of a dumping ground for random programming practice sessions that I've had since 2003. And there are so many things wrong with the architecture of it that I would rather just rebuild it, I think. And obviously there's a lot of details in Computron that would be useful to anybody building a new system emulator, but I think that those can be referenced rather than directly copied over. Let's see, let me try to catch up here. Devashish says, do you watch horror movies? Anyone in particular that you liked? Well, I don't watch them anymore. I used to watch them when I was younger, and it got to the point where I had to admit to myself that I don't like feeling scared by horror movies. I think when I was a teenager, I thought that it was cool to watch horror movies, and I would watch them to sort of prove to myself that I was cool. And then at some point I realized, wait a minute, why am I making myself feel bad? Just so that I can think that I'm cool for feeling bad. So I don't know. But when I did watch them, I did watch a lot of like 1980s slashers, like the Friday the 13th series and like Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, stuff like that. I guess that was the sort of the genre that I was into. But I don't enjoy the way they make me feel. They make me feel nervous and unpleasant, so I don't do it anymore, really. Let's see. Mehu says, "Hey Andreas, do you have any textbook recommendations for systems programming?" I don't really. I haven't read many books about this kind of thing. I've just learned by participating in projects. So people often ask me like, what book or resource do I recommend? And I don't really have a good book or resource to recommend. Instead, I recommend participating in projects where they do the kind of things that you want to learn about. That's the environment where I've learned about all of these things, at least. And it seems to be working. So let's see. Federico says, "I know there are other videos about that, but can you explain where all the widgets are rendered to the screen?" I've talked about that many times. And there's even a live stream in my live streams playlist where I talk only about that, or almost only. But basically, widgets are rendered into a window, and then windows are composited onto the screen. And if you go look at my live streams playlist right here, there is, wait a minute, this is where we are now. That's confusing. Let's see. Here, live tour, widgets and painting in SerenityOS. That's where we talk about how that works. So I recommend catching up on that. Let me close that. Let's see. Mustafa says, "Why not just have separate repos for certain large components, such as the JS and web engine? I feel like I'm having to do big builds on dual core machine more than I would like because of libjs changes." Why not just? Is this hacker news? We are a monorepo project, and that is a philosophical thing that we will not change. That doesn't mean that we can't improve the build process so that you could opt out of building certain parts of it. And there have been some steps towards componentizing or compartmentalizing the build, but there isn't a straightforward way to do that at the moment. But talk to Gunnar and Max, maybe. They were doing a bunch of stuff in that area. Let's see. Mehdi says, "Why does Serenity boot so fast?" It is because it doesn't do that much when it boots up. We just try to get the system up on screen quickly. And we also don't like run scripts and stuff like that on boot. Everything is native code. And while it is still faster than the majority of existing or other systems, it has been getting slower. And it seems to me that the primary reason for that is the shared libraries. So dynamically linking things on startup is just a heavy cost. And there are various strategies we can use to make it better, make it faster, but it's something where we need to dig into it at some point. But I mean, the system, I say that it's regressed, but it still boots in 2 seconds on my machine if I'm not recording at the same time or streaming. Like if I'm just sitting here without any other stuff going on, it boots in 2 or 2.5 seconds. So to me, that's still very, very nice. But it would be, of course, lovely to bring that down to 1 second or less. But yeah, that will require some digging into how we can improve the dynamic linking. That said, though, like we can certainly make the system appear to boot faster by doing some simpler stuff, like just reorganizing the order in which things start up and trying to get sort of the right image on the screen faster by making a lot of things lazy, and probably by, I don't know, I don't want to speculate too much. This should be profile driven, really. So Pablo says, if I want to create, let's say, a console-based text editor, can I use the curses.h header? I don't care if I have to use ports. Well, if you want to use curses, then you have to use a port. We don't have curses in Serenity. You have to use the curses port. But if you use a port, if you depend on a port, then we will not integrate your console-based text editor in the system. The system itself should not have any hard dependencies on ports. Yuval says, what did you think about LangJam's theme? Yeah, so the LangJam theme, the first inaugural LangJam theme was first class comments, right? And I thought that was an interesting choice for a theme. I didn't really know what to expect because I'm not really familiar with jam culture, but I remember when I saw the announcement of it, and I thought that I wasn't even participating in the jam, but I felt like stuck, like, oh my God, what is even a first class comment? Like I felt really lost. So I guess that made it a good theme. And I looked at some of the people in the Serenity Discord were participating in LangJam, and I saw some of the languages that they were working on, and it looked like people were having fun. So I'm glad that they were. Let's see. Mustafa says, maybe even just allowing a build without the browser would solve the issue. Yeah, I mean, maybe that would solve the issue for you. One thing is that the system leans on libjs and libweb for many things, not just the browser. But actually, JavaScript is used by other stuff like Assistant and Spreadsheet, obviously. So you would have to opt out of building those things as well. And then the web engine and JavaScript engine is used by the help system, so you would have to opt out of that. But if you build sort of something like the Linux kernel has this menu config thing, right? Like if you had something like that where dependencies are automatically updated based on your choices, then you could probably do something pretty nice with that. Okay. So let's see. Kevin says, something I'm seeing more is the use of fuzzing along with unit and integration tests. Do you have any experience with that kind of testing? Sure. Yeah, we actively fuzz Serenity, actually. We are on the OSS fuzz infrastructure. So this is something that Google provides. And let's see. Where is the thing where we search for the bugs? Here. So here, if we search for Serenity on the Google OSS fuzz cloud fuzzing infrastructure, then you can find that we have a whole bunch of fuzz bugs. Wait, can I select open issues? Yes. So basically the way this works is that we have fuzzers in Serenity that build for Linux, and then we have integration with OSS Fuzz, so they regularly build these Linux-based fuzzers that take some part of Serenity, build it for Linux, and then fuzz it on their infrastructure. And as you can see, there's a whole bunch of open bugs, and we've also fixed a lot of bugs that were found by these fuzzers. And I think it's a very, very good thing to do. And it's an important thing to use when you're doing when you're using a language that has some amount of memory on safety, then fuzzing is important. Oh, Mustafa is asking, what is fuzzing? So fuzzing is basically that you generate random garbage input, and then you send it to you give it to your code, and then you see how it reacts, and then you mutate the input and give it different things, and try to provoke it into crashing or otherwise displaying some kind of bug. And you can do like completely random inputs, but you can also be smart. And then, for example, if you're fuzzing a JavaScript implementation, you have an input generator that produces something that looks like valid JavaScript, maybe even is. And then maybe it does a bunch of weird JavaScript code, weird API calls and stuff to try to provoke the JavaScript engine into having a bug. And that's what fuzzing is. So you generate thousands and millions of random test cases and give it to your thing and then see if it breaks. And OSS Fuzz does this on a large parts of Serenity for free, which is super awesome. And yeah, so if you're using any kind of memory unsafe language, then I think fuzzing is like really important because it will find bugs for you. Luke says for JS that would be Fuzzily. Right, we don't run Fuzzily on OSS Fuzz. I don't know if that would be possible. Fuzzily is a very competent JavaScript. It does quite competent JavaScript fuzzing, as I understand. It's a JavaScript engine fuzzer, right? So this is something from Google where they produce test cases that look like this, for example, and say that maybe this thing causes your engine to choke for whatever reason. And Luke is one of our fuzz masters, and he's frequently or semi-frequently opening bugs found by fuzzers. And sometimes he fixes them too, I think. So that's very nice. Thank you, Luke. Let's see. Big Knife Wrangler says, actually, how would one go about making an ed or VI clone for Serenity? Well, you would go about it the same way that you would go about building anything for Serenity. You would do it by starting from scratch and then leveraging whatever libraries we already have for the functionality you need, and then filling in the rest by yourself. We don't currently have any kind of terminal UI library or toolkit for that, so you essentially would have to either build a TUI toolkit first along with this, or speak directly in terminal escape sequences. That's the closest thing to a terminal UI library we have is libline, which implements the line editor used by Shell and the JavaScript REPL. So that libline speaks in escape sequences to the terminal. And that's what you would have to do as well. Let's see. Harshit says, hello, like new config server in Serenity, is there anything similar for Linux or for Qt? Well, Qt has Q settings, right? I think that's what you use there. And Q settings is kind of an platform abstraction. So it's backed by different things on different systems. As far as I know, that's how you use settings on Qt. But I'm not particularly familiar with how that works. But look into it. Let's see. Panta says, what are your thoughts about combating the lava flow syndrome? How do you keep older parts of the system in sync with the latest thinking and patterns as the project grows? Right. So the best way to do that, I think, is to just work on random parts of the system randomly whenever inspiration strikes. I I like continuous refactoring culture. That's something that I learned from WebKit, where WebKit is continuously refactored and improved to propagate new patterns, new thinking. And they're able to do that because of their extensive test infrastructure. And as our test infrastructure grows and improves, I would very much like us to have a similar culture of continuous refactoring, continuous improvement. And one thing that prevents this in Serenity is that a lot of the new thinking and new patterns end up in our framework libraries like ACK or libcore. And if you were using something and we think of something smarter than that, then we're not going to keep the less smart thing around. So we'll just by necessity have to go and find all uses of the less smart abstraction, replace them with the smarter abstraction, and then a lot of old code gets updated automatically just by doing that. But obviously, like some things, there is some bit rot that happens. And I think that I feel like a personal responsibility to go and work on everything in the system, because I feel like obviously I feel some amount of ownership of the whole thing. And I guess I'm hoping that other people will also come to feel the same way about parts of the system or the entire system. And when you feel like you own something, then you feel like you have a responsibility to it, right? And I think that's how we avoid that. I'd never heard that expression, lava flow syndrome, before. That's very interesting. I like it. Let's see. So Pablo says, how is the drawing API works for Serenity? Is there OpenGL or is there a frame buffer somewhere? Put pixel function or something like that. How do I draw stuff on screen? You do not draw directly on screen. You draw into a window. And then I have plenty of videos about how that works. So again, I recommend checking out on my YouTube channel in the playlists, in the live streams playlist. I recommend checking out the live tour widgets and painting. I should just actually copy link. Let me do that. Let's see, what was it called? Live tour widgets and painting. Hopefully I'm doing that right. Also, shout outs to the hater who disliked this stream that we are on right now. Why are you here? Okay, let's see. So, next step. Alex says, my question didn't send. Okay, well, I'm guessing that you're sending it again. Alex here. I like the new config server you added this week. Do you have in mind other places where it might make sense to have a common server handling data? I think I don't necessarily have anything specific in mind, but certainly in the web browser, you have the situation that you have, like, if you build any kind of cache for downloaded resources and keep those on disk, then you might have multiple browsers that want to access that cache. And I'm not exactly sure what is the best approach for that. If you want to have a sort of a cache process that manages a browser cache, or if you want to do something where the various web content processes coordinate somehow. I don't know. But I don't have anything specific in mind. And I also like the config server thing, although like I don't like the APIs for it yet, but I think it's this sort of thing where you have to start hacking on it to discover what kind of API you want. Because if you just sit there and dream about what is the perfect API for this or that, that's not really my style of development. So for me to make progress on something, I need to start hacking on it. And a config server it's something that I think is going to really level the system up in terms of integration between apps and in terms of just a general feeling of quality, I guess. Because it's been very ad hoc around those areas, and it feels like very meaningful progress at a system level, which it's a bit funny because when the project was younger, then almost every day there would be some like meaningful progress on whole system feel, and now that sort of thing happens less commonly. I think that's ultimately a good thing, like, because it just means that we've gotten to a good place. But I really enjoy when we come up with some good way to improve the system, right? Yeah, I don't know exactly where my mind wants to go with that, but I'm happy about it so far, and it needs a lot more work. So Liam says, is there horizontal scrolling support in Serenity Terminal? Ooh, horizontal scrolling support in the terminal. No. Is there such a thing as a terminal that has horizontal scrolling? I don't think I've ever seen that. Fascinating. In my mind, generally speaking, horizontal scrolling is unpleasant. I feel whenever I end up on a website that has horizontal scrolling, I feel like they're annoying me. Now, I could understand if you have a language that is laid out in such a way that horizontal scrolling is what makes sense. But if you're reading like English text on a horizontally scrolling website, that's so weird. And I don't know how that would work in a terminal. Let's see. Fuzzing is the holy grail for exploit writers. Right, fuzzing is amazing for exploitation, because you can like write a decent fuzzer for something, and then you just let it like run it, and then maybe hopefully at some point later it wakes up and it tells you, oh, if I give this input, then the thing crashes, and you don't have to do any kind of you don't have to like look for the bug yourself. Like the fuzzer can find it for you. And then of course you have to figure out what the bug is and how to exploit it. But it is an amazing tool for getting ideas for exploits. Let's see. YouTube doesn't like 2x speed on streams. Yeah, sorry about that. I guess if you start the stream from the beginning now, then you can watch it in 2x. Let's see. Matthias says maybe one of the Electron terminal emulators has horizontal scroll. Yeah, maybe it does. It's so weird. Let's see. Pseudonatural says, little question. Is there a possibility for an ARM port of Serenity in the next 2 to 3 years? Well, if you work on it, then it will be finished when you finish it. I don't have a plan for anything in particular, and I don't know anybody else who has a plan either. But you are welcome to implement it and give us your time frame when you feel comfortable sharing it. Mustafa says, do you prefer small and succinct PRs, like using a newer API, or do you prefer if they're bundled together with other related changes? It feels weird submitting a PR with 4 to 5 lines changed. I love small and succinct PRs. 4 to 5 lines changed in the PR that's perfect. I think it's so nice when people are able to express a meaningful change in a very small set of lines. To me, like surgical programming is virtuous, and it's just so nice when you get these pull requests, because it shows that the person who made it values precision, and I value precision as well. That is assuming that the change is correct, of course. Kevin Bowron says, listen to an interview with Zig language creator Andrew Kelly, shoutouts to Andrew, about moving from part to full-time on a side project. Very cool that Patreon et al. Allow for new funding models. Yes, I also listened to that interview. Where the heck was that? Andrew Kelly, it was on the co-recursive, I think. Full-time open source with Andrew Kelly. Yes, I'm going to drop it in the chat. Oh no, I've lost my second window. Wait, how do I get it back? Let's see. I am getting better at streaming. I think it just sometimes it's a little bit messy. Okay, yeah. So there's the link to this interview with Andrew of the Zig project, and I totally agree that it is amazing that you can crowdfund open source projects in this way that Andrew is doing and that I'm now doing myself. And I just read just yesterday, I think, about the Haiku project and how they are hiring somebody to work full-time on their project. And it's all from crowdfunding and donations. And I think that's such a beautiful thing that has sprung up around here, that we have these projects built not just for like profit-seeking purposes, right? But out of passion and love for programming and love for software, and people find it valuable enough that they want to support it, and it enables people like Andrew and myself to do it full time. And I don't know, obviously it's very special to me, and I think it's just such a beautiful thing. And I'm very, very grateful to be alive in a time where this is possible. It is kick-ass, and very, very grateful to everybody who's supporting me so I'm able to do this. It's just it's so cool. Anyways, Mr. Number here says, I have plans for developing x86-64 simple OS, not like Serenity, just for learning purpose. What was the most complicating part in Serenity development, and do you have some suggestions? I don't know, just start. Don't be one of these people who sits around planning to do something. Just start doing it. Start doing it right now. And I think your chances to succeed at something are very proportional to your willingness to start doing it. Don't be a planner, be a starter. That's my advice. Liam says, horizontal scrolling in Less and Vim. I see. Well, we have a Less implementation, but I don't know that it supports horizontal scrolling. We would have to investigate that. Peter wrote a new Less implementation for Serenity. Let's see what happens if we make a narrow window and then we less etc password. No, it appears to wrap the lines, And also it does not respond well to terminal resizing. So yeah, it seems like it just wraps. And if the Vim port has horizontal scrolling, I don't know. I guess it depends on what escape sequences they use to implement that. I don't recall if there are any particular VT100 escape sequences related to horizontal scrolling. I don't know. Let's see. Mehdi says, I tried to play the piano on Serenity, but there was no sound. Have you any idea why is that? I have no idea. It worked the last time I was testing it, but I admit I haven't tested it for a long time. But we'll see. We should probably look into that at some point. If the sound doesn't work, feel free to open a bug about it. Make sure to include what kind of host machine you're running this on. And then we can look into what's going wrong. So Kyle says, now that we have a config server, do you think we should have a central GUI for application settings a la Apple? Do you mean something like oh my goodness, like the settings application, something like this? Because I do think we should have a central GUI application for application settings, yes. Now, obviously, this does not expose everything that is in config server, but the idea here is to provide meaningful GUI for things, and we should definitely expand the settings that you can modify here. Let's see. Pseudonatural says, I would love to be able to port it, but I haven't even been able to port any apps successfully, so it would take me years to port Serenity even to Raspberry Pi. I think if you start actively working on it, it will not take you years. But yes, it's something that requires serious engagement. Like you can't like casually port a system to a new architecture or something like that. But if you are determined to do it, then of course you can figure out how to do it. Let's see. Leonardo says, have you used the multiple selections feature in C-Line to change multiple lines at the same time? Yes, I have used it. I have, people keep recommending me these multi-selection and multiple cursor features, and I'm aware of them. I've used them many times, but they're not in my muscle memory, so I forget to use them, and then people complain that I don't use them. But yes, I just have to get better at remembering to use them. I think my problem is that for some reason I don't think of them when I'm in a situation where it would be useful, and I don't know exactly what would be something good for that. I do have this what's it called, a key promoter plugin set up, so that if I click on something that has a keyboard shortcut, then it tells me, hey, why don't you use a keyboard shortcut? It would be cool if, this is obviously a very difficult problem, but it would be cool if the IDE would tell you like, hey, I noticed that you're doing something that would benefit from multiple cursors or multiple selections. Also, why am I so itchy today? M. Costa says, what would be a good process for a bigger project? Let's say someone wants to create a game as complex as the original Doom, i.e. something impossible to do in a single PR. You mean building something in Serenity that is a large and complex system in itself? I think we have ongoing processes like that all the time. And in my mind, the best thing to do is to just sketch out the basic architecture of your thing into code, preferably, and then you sort of build out a scaffolding and of like, oh, these are the major objects in my thing, and this is the basic ownership model. So like you have, I don't know, if we're talking about something like Doom, so you would have like, I don't know, a game class that it's like the big global mother object, and then it owns, I don't know, like level objects that have maps, and then it has a player object that has some state, and like you would kind of, I don't know, sketch out all of these different objects that exist in your thing, and then don't actually implement them, just sketch them out so that we can get a feel for what type of thing you're trying to build. At least that's how I tend to start new things. For example, if you look at my video where I started building the JavaScript engine for Serenity, you can see that I start by just hacking out a simple AST and a simple JavaScript value class, just to sort of show to myself and to everybody reading along that, like, okay, so these are the major objects and their relationships with each other that we're going to be building here. I think that is how I would recommend starting on something like that. And then you start by doing that, and then once you have those things in place, then you start fleshing them out and implementing their behaviors and their relationships and communications and so on. Yuval says, what do you think was the best year in your life? This one right now, by far. This is the best year of my life. And to be honest with you, every day is a little bit better than the previous one. So things are going pretty well. Thank you for asking. Mustafa says, Filmroshan on Discord has been working on libDSP and piano earlier today. There's a PR up that may have fixed the audio issue. Yeah, maybe we should check that out. That is very cool. I like that somebody cares about audio in the system. It's sort of it feels sometimes like we are neglecting the little audio subsystem, and I'm very happy to see Filmroshan working on it. Let's see. Mustafa says, maybe I should make up a multi-cursor worksheet for you to practice. Would you? That would be nice. And Sam says, what I'm hearing is C-Line should bring back Clippy. Ooh, yes, but maybe instead of a paperclip, it could be an actual C-Line. Let's see. C-Line mascot. Is there such a thing? Oh, look at this little guy. See, can you imagine this guy teaching you how to use multi-cursors? That would be amazing. I would listen to this fella. I mean, some of these are good. This is a little sketchy. Anyways, now we're getting off track here. Let's see. Toto says, less-s will not chop line. Could be useful when used with column to visualize CSV files, for example, but that's a very peculiar use case. Sure, that does sound like a peculiar use case. Kevin says, have you done any interviews or podcasts about Serenity and the move to full-time on the project? I could see you on an episode of Co-Recursive. Is it Co-Recursive or Core-Cursive? Either way, I have done a number of interviews actually in the past 2 weeks. And I don't know exactly when they will be published, but I will let you know. And I guess that's something that I have a whole bunch of invitations to all kinds of things, and I'm trying to space them out a little bit, and also I'm trying to do things where it feels like fun and meaningful, and like I would be speaking to an audience of like-minded people. I don't know. I guess I'm a little bit concerned because I don't want to just show off what we're working on. I want to if I do interviews and stuff like that, I want to reach people who are interested in joining us and interested in doing this type of stuff. Not just like show off like, oh, look at what we're doing. So that's something that I always keep in mind. But yeah, there's some stuff coming up for sure. So Yuval says, do you prefer cats, dogs, or cat dog? I prefer cats, actually. Paul says, hi, Andreas. Where do you get your desktop background images? They are so cool. I get them from all kinds of sources, actually. Like here, for example, Google Images. I get so many of my desktops on Google Images. I also go to the 4chan wallpaper board and browse around. So you can often find interesting threads here, like post-apocalyptic, and then they have all kinds of interesting post-apocalyptic wallpapers. Let's see. Mustafa says, you know what? I would make you a worksheet. We'll report back soon. Okay, just make sure to put a cute sea lion mascot on it, please. On the plus side, I can also give it to some of my university students. Yes, that would be perfect. Please make sure to also put cute sea lion mascots on their copies. Hasturtium says, what specific challenges are involved in bringing 3D accelerated graphics to Serenity? I don't know. I guess the specific challenge at this point is surveying the landscape and figuring out what would be required. So like grabbing first, I guess first off, you have to decide which chip you want to implement support for. So presumably like the closest thing we would do is probably one of the virtualized things. So like the Vert.io GPU, if that thing has 3D accelerated graphics, I don't actually know. Or I know VMware has some 3D acceleration stuff. And then Intel has documentation for their stuff, so that's an option. But really, like at this point, from my perspective, the challenge is figuring out what exactly it is. And what needs to be done. So I have basically as much information as you do because I haven't looked at it. Laurinas says, greetings from Lithuania. Thank you for the content you provide. It reminds me of the days I used to work on my own OS back in the day. Your videos teach and calm me down at the same time. Well, I'm glad to hear that, Laurinas. I visited Lithuania 10 years ago, and it was an absolutely lovely place. So good job on that. So IP says, is porting Chromium or Firefox to Serenity viable, or are there technical issues with that, e.g. due to lack of graphical drivers? It's perfectly viable, it's just a lot of work. And also it's like very uninteresting work compared to doing anything else on the system. At least from my perspective, it's so much more interesting to build our own browser engine and our own JavaScript engine. And porting Chromium or Firefox feels like, well, you know, if you're going to start doing that, then what are we even trying to do here? Like what's the point? But if somebody's interested in doing it, then it's perfectly possible. It's just a bunch of work. And personally, I would probably port WebKit if I was going to port something, because I'm intimately familiar with how it works. But anybody could. Kyle says, he was on Ars Technica the other day. That is right. We were on Ars Technica. If you haven't seen it, they had a feature article about Serenity, which was very positive and very pleasant. And I will link that in the chat. And I will close that because it's playing video. Why do you autoplay video, Ars Technica? Please. X7D says, what kind of code editing shortcuts do you use to move around and select stuff, etc. in your IDE, and how does it compare to Vim shortcuts for editing? What kind of code editing shortcuts? Oh, I guess the main one I use is the navigator thingy that you bring up. So by default, you press Shift, and then it allows you to search for random stuff. So I can type in the name of a function or the name of a class or the name of a file, and it sort of searches everything. So if I just type here GUI widget, then I can find my way to GUI widget, but I can also type the name of a class like core object and find my way to that class. And I have it bound to Control K because of muscle memory from QCreator. And I think that's the main navigation thing I use. But then when it comes to just navigating around on the line, I just use like Control left, Control right, basic cursor movement. I'm not a very fancy move around guy. I just move pretty fast, and maybe it looks fancy. I don't know. I never really feel like I'm held back by my ability to move around. I know a lot of people ask me like, well, why don't you use Vim bindings for CLine? And I've tried it, and it didn't make me feel any faster. And I'm very familiar with Vim, but I think people have this weird idea that Vim bindings are somehow faster, and I don't really agree with that. And I've used Vim for over 15 years, so I don't know. Anyway, Osamu says, what do you think about someone doing a series, blog, or even a whole course about the Serenity operating system, code structure, understanding the code, etc.? I think that would be amazing. I would absolutely love to see something like that. And if somebody would start working on something like that, I would try to help them, within reason, if they have questions or if they need some help or guidance. And I think that this system would make a really, really good. I think it's very, very good for instructional purposes or educational purposes. And there are so many instructive things in our code base. But it can also be a bit overwhelming for people who are less experienced with C++ or large code bases in general. So somebody doing a series like that would be really awesome. Yeah, and it's not really something that I would do myself, but I would love to see somebody else tackle this type of project. Yeah. Let's see. Mustafa says, what's been the one thing you've disliked developing the most? Serenity. Oh, the one thing I've disliked. I don't know that I don't know that I dislike anything of the system. I guess sometimes it is tedious to deal with like subtle and hard to reproduce kernel bugs. I don't really love sitting around waiting for some weird, unusual condition to occur, right? So that also relates to your next question here. What is the longest time you've spent hunting down a bug? I think probably, I don't know, like a week or something like that. And the long bugs were almost always kernel bugs. Because in user space, there's like, you can have weird user space bugs, but there's at least some frame that they will stay within, right? And there's only so many ways that you can crash in user space, but in the kernel, you can crash and thrash and make a real mess of things in an unlimited number of ways. And for that reason, I think kernel bugs can be a lot more tedious to debug. Let's see. Mustafa says disliked making it, not dislike the actual thing itself. Oh. Huh. I don't know. I think I liked making this whole thing. And I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't love all of it. And I'm really, really glad that so many people found this and fell in love with it too, to the point where they also want to work on it. I think it's an extraordinary thing. And I always try to tell people, don't do something if you don't love doing it, right? I mean, when it comes to Serenity, like, don't build something because somebody told you to, or because you think it would be good, but you actually don't care. Build the things that you care about and the things that you would love to see. And we have this pervasive culture of like everybody putting their passion into every little corner that they work on, and the end result is just beautiful. So I really don't think that there is something I disliked working on, disliked making. There have been times, of course, where I've been frustrated with myself because I didn't make good progress, or because I didn't like the way something turned out, but I still liked doing it. Let's see, Christopher says, why are edit widgets known as hard to code from scratch? I guess you mean like a text editor widget or something like that. And they can be difficult because text editing is fairly complex. So especially if you want to support like the entire Unicode range of text, and you can't have these comfortable assumptions like every character is 1 byte, stuff like that. There's all kinds of stuff that goes into it, not just like the measuring and drawing of text, but also other stuff like dealing with font. It says, no, the actual edit widget. Wait, what's the edit widget? Which edit widget? I don't know what that means, the edit widget. Let's see. Oh, I don't know how to pronounce this. I'm sorry. But I can repeat someone else's question. But what was the biggest challenge during OS development that you've solved? Oh. I think this is a bit of a weird answer, but I think the greatest challenge, the greatest challenge of an OS development is building a community of people who want to work on the operating system. Because there are basically 2 ways of doing that. You can either pay people a lot of money, or you can make something that is irresistible to them so that they join you. And that, like, getting people to join me in this is definitely the biggest challenge I have solved, I would say. Probably not the type of answer you were looking for, but that's sort of where my mind is about that. Let's see. M. Costa says, does Serenity have a vector drawing library like Cairo? No, we don't have a vector drawing library. We do have bits and pieces. So we have SVG support in the web browser, but very, very limited. And we have vector drawing in our font, or TrueType font rendering engine. So it, like, TrueType fonts are vectors, right? So we have that, but there isn't like a generic nice vector drawing API or anything like that. Let's see. The text edit one, like in the text editor. Let's see. Edit widget. Okay, so edit widget or text input. Widget as in GUI component. I have heard that it's hard to code because there's probably a lot of work to implement all the functionality. Well, yes, that's exactly right. It is hard to build a very competent text editing input widget. But it is not terribly hard to build a very simple one. So for example, when I did the port of Diablo to Serenity, I came across the text input widget that they had in the Diablo game, which was used to input the character name when you were creating a character. And this was a while ago now, but if I recall correctly, the way that worked was that they just had a text array with like the characters, and then you could only press backspace to go backwards. And if you pressed backspace, it would just erase the last character and then repaint the thing. And if you limit your functionality to that point, then it is pretty easy to build a text input widget. But the problem with text input is that there is a very high ceiling of functionality that you can add, right? So if you look at the text input widget in Serenity, a large part of the complexity comes from undo. So you want the ability to undo what you just did. So we have to keep track of that, which means that the mutations of the text have to be command-based so that you can replay or unplay commands, and that makes the code more complex. And then there's also all of the complexity that comes from wrapping. So if you want to have text that doesn't wrap, it's pretty easy. But if you want to wrap, you have to figure out where are the word boundaries, and then you have to create a separate representation of your lines. Like, so this is the line physically on disk, but actually to display it within the constraints of this widget, I have to break the line here, here, and here, stuff like that. So there's a lot of complexity depending on what level of functionality you want to have. But a very simple widget, easy. It's just that most people expect text widgets to have pretty sophisticated functionality, I guess. I hope that answers your question. Abhishek says, how did you implement the libraries for keyboard input, display text on screen from kernel space? So far, I have only been able to display text. So keyboard input, you need to hook into the IRQ for your keyboard. So basically, if you're talking about a PC architecture operating system, I assume you're in the context of x86 operating system development, you want to hook into the keyboard IRQ, and then when you get it, you want to fetch the scan code from the keyboard device via IO instructions. And I'm sure that they have probably on OS Dev something about that. Yeah, so I'm sure that you can read about it on the osdev.org wiki, and they will tell you what to do. But basically, whenever there's something to read in the keyboard buffer, it will give you an IRQ, and once you get it, you read from the keyboard. Let's see. Ali says graphics path is a thing. That's true. The GFX path class is a thing, but I wouldn't call it like a first class vector library necessarily. Let's see. Mustafa says, it was really nice hanging out with you. Goodbye. Gonna work on some more Serenity stuff this afternoon. Awesome. Yes. And actually on that note, I have to leave now as well. So I'm gonna say it was really nice hanging with you all, and goodbye. And I'm also gonna work on some more Serenity stuff this afternoon. I hope everybody will have a great weekend. I really appreciate all of the visitings. And everybody who came, all the super chats, thank you. And yeah, let's have a good weekend and hack on stuff that we care about. So that's it. See ya.